Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, prepare to delve into the world of perennial tree collards. Most people are familiar with collards that grow in your vegetable garden in the summertime, but did you know there are perennial relatives that can grow up to the size of a small tree and live 8 years or longer? Today, Sequoiah from Project Tree Collard joins us to tell us all about these amazing plants. Stick with us.
Sequoiah, thanks for coming on the show. Your first ever podcast interview, is that right?
It is.
Well, I think a good place to start is maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you got into doing the work you're doing, when you became interested in perennial vegetables or the types of plants that you're working with, and we could take it from there.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited. So my gardening background actually started when I was 5. My parents noticed they had an organic vegetable garden. We had goats and chickens, and I was raised on the eggs and the goat milk. I started being interested in vegetable gardening around age 5. And so they were like, okay, well, we'll give you this area you can plant with whatever. So I grew a bunch of annual things. I didn't jump in with perennial vegetables, but that's where it started. And then just throughout my life, I would always plant a garden. Even if I lived somewhere in college for 3 months, I would plant vegetables basically, and not even be there for the harvest. I would move to another place and plant some more vegetables and leave. And I was kind of all over the place. I ended up in India when I was 21, and I was way in the north in Ladakh in the mountains. And there's a wonderful environmental organization there. I don't know if it still exists, but at the time it was really groundbreaking. And they had a library with all these amazing books, and they had the giant permaculture manuals. And so I spent a lot of time, I was trying to acclimate to the altitude. I think the town was at 18,000 feet, and I wanted to go trekking. Or no, I think it was lower, sorry. It was like 14,000 feet, and I wanted to go trekking up to 18,000 feet. So I was trying to acclimate. And so I spent a lot of time in the library reading this permaculture manual. And I remembered that in high school, actually, my parents took us to Australia, and we stayed on a permaculture farm in 1989 or 87. And so I'd been introduced to it then and been very interested in water catchment and different things. So when I got a hold of this manual, I just started taking furious notes about it, and it really captivated my interest. At that time, it was more about the design aspects, about the land and the water use and the topography and the general principles of permaculture. Fast forwarding, after spending a year and a half traveling and coming back to the US, I was in an art education program in grad school that I dropped out of, and just on a whim thought to myself, I want to study landscape design and construction. So I went to a junior college and spent the next 4 years working in a nursery, having my own gardening clients, and doing that program, in which I did take a permaculture class. I always intended on my business being about encouraging people to connect with growing their own food. That was really my passion. And it just never really happened. I ended up with a landscaping career of over 20 years. And I was always sneaking in, how about an apple tree, or how about a persimmon? They have beautiful fall color, and you can eat the fruit, and the fruit is so beautiful. And even if you don't like persimmons, the birds can eat it. And I was always encouraging people to grow different things like an artichoke, or sneak in perennial vegetables here and there. But I found for the most part that either I would plant the vegetable garden for them, and they didn't ever really have that great of a passion or connection with it because they hadn't done the work. They hadn't been super involved in the process. So that became very frustrating. And at some point, I was meditating, and this name came to me while I was meditating, which was Project Tree Collard. And it was very bizarre because I just came out of this meditation with those words on my tongue, Project Tree Collard. And I had been growing tree collards for quite a while, but I hadn't particularly thought that much about them. And I was like, wow, I have no idea what that's about. 2 months later, I was starting a website and starting to sell cuttings of purple tree collards only. And I just thought, why not? They're not available all over the place or consistently. And they're such a great plant. Why not just try this out? And that was how Project Tree Collard was born.
That's an incredible origin story, I have to say. I read somewhere on, maybe it was your website or somewhere on Instagram, something about the merit tree collard as well. What's the history there with that particular chance seedling?
So I went to Merritt College for landscape design and construction, and that's where I studied permaculture. And up on the campus, they had some tree collards growing. And my boyfriend was actually up there, and he's at the time, and he saw this chance seedling growing on the hillside, and he just brought home a small green cutting of it. He's like, I saw this really cool green tree collard. We might want to just try this. And so I stuck it straight in the soil, not thinking much of it. And it grew very, very quickly. And then it just became this amazing plant with this giant, giant trunk. It didn't need support, and it grew up, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet. And I was like, wow, I've got to propagate more of this. And I started a whole row of them, and then more and more of them, and realized it was such a great screening plant. And it was such an amazing plant full of personality.
Maybe before we go any further, Sequoiah, a lot of our listeners will know at least a little bit about tree collards or perennial kales, but could you maybe just, for people who haven't heard of a tree collard before, just explain maybe the difference between something they might be more familiar with, like just a regular garden variety collard?
Yeah, it's funny. I've never been into the annual collards, but in fact, I've never ever grown them because here in California, the tree collards grow so well and they're perennial, and it just seems like a no-brainer. Why bother planting all these little seeds and going through all the trouble of raising them and watering them just for a few months of collard greens? But I think the main difference is that you can grow tree collards from seed. They're not going to be true to type because nobody that I know of separates their tree collards enough to make sure that they don't cross-pollinate with other brassicas. But people who start with a particular type of an annual Georgia blue, let's say, annual collard, they go through all this trouble to get those collard greens, and the perennial ones, if you want to clone, you got to propagate them from cuttings. So that's the big difference, is you get collards for a short season, or you get collards for many years to come and can repropagate from those cuttings, from those original plants many, many times, and give them away to friends and family.
Maybe just some context for our listeners who are more familiar with the annuals. Collards, to someone living on the East Coast in New England, is something more like a kale that grows like 3 feet or so and then dies back, and then, or you pull it out of the ground and throw it in your compost heap. But the tree collards that we're talking about, like purple tree collard or some of these other chance seedlings, they can grow pretty big. And in terms of how long they can grow for, I mean, how long have you had some of those trees? I'm calling them trees because they literally, they're like trees. What would you say the longest or oldest plant that you have at either property would be?
Well, in my Berkeley farm, which I'm still taking care of, working with those plants still, I think maybe the oldest things I have are Dobbinton kale, like a perennial kale that's variegated. But I don't know. I tend to actually be a little ruthless with my tree collards because they're part of my business. And so I really want to keep them very productive. So I tend to not let them live once they're not producing a lot of cuttings. So when they look really tall and a lot of wood and they're kind of falling over or scrappy looking, I tend to take cuttings and start again, new patches constantly. So it's kind of a rotation. Like tree collards have grown in every bed of that quarter-acre garden in Berkeley, but none of them have been around that long. I think some of the oldest plants I have for 4 or 5 years.
I mean, even 4 or 5 years is pretty amazing considering most people are used to having the annual vegetables that they grow for 3 months. What we're talking about here is this large shrubby collard tree that you can pick greens from, in your climate all year round. Something I guess we didn't totally hone in on for our listeners is exactly what Project Tree Collard is today. So like you got the idea for Project Tree Collard, and then maybe going back to that story, like, how, just maybe in a little bit more detail, what exactly is Project Tree Collard?
Yeah, it's changed over time. At first, my goal was just with the purple tree collards because that's all I had, sharing the plant with the world and sending out the cuttings. And then pretty quickly I realized, oh, people actually really want these. And some people are not successful growing them from cuttings, even though I feel like they're very, very easy. So I decided to start rooting them and growing them as plants and sending those out. And then eventually realized, even though they rarely bloom, that people would want those seeds. And so every time I had access to any tree collards, purple tree collards that were seeding, I would collect those seeds and started selling those as well. And then it very quickly branched out to the merit tree collard and to one I got from Rebecca Newburn in the Richmond Grows Seed Library called Dinosaur Kale. That was a chance cross in her garden with Dinosaur Kale, the annual with the purple tree collard. And then I got Dobbinton, and then I started to get more and more experimental and start offering some chance seedlings that came up in my garden. So it really has been up to this point trying to collect information from customers growing them in all these different climates, from Florida and Hawaii to New England and greenhouses, Michigan, all kinds of places. So collecting that information, hearing what people's experiences are with the different seeds and cuttings and plants that they buy. And then also trying to come up with new varieties over time. And that takes quite a few years to develop those and see how they perform. So Project Tree Collard is really a focus on coming up with different varieties of tree collards to share with the world. And I encourage everybody to share them with all their friends and family as well. So I always joke that my eventual goal is to go out of business, to put myself out of business, because everyone will have all these types of tree collards and they'll be sharing them with each other, and there will be no need to purchase them.
And your work will be done.
The world will be covered with tree collards. I mean, it's one of the more exciting things that I do, especially like international seeds. I'll send them abroad. I can't send them cuttings or plants, but it's really fun having correspondence with people, let's say in Africa, where they probably originated from. And they're like, yeah, we want to just mix up our gene pool of these perennial collards, and sharing them with people in Jamaica and Philippines and all over. They're hard to get to Australia for some reason. The customs can get a bit stuck in customs.
So when we're talking about annual vegetables, one of the downfalls is that they're often significantly less nutritious than their perennial counterparts. A lot of that has to do with the fact that their root systems are just developing for years and years and years. And having a plant in the ground for 4 or 5 years is going to produce much more highly nutritional leaves than something that has to grow like crazy and you feed it fertilizer, and in only 2 or 3 months it puts all this energy into creating these leafy greens for you. So we're just wondering if you know of anyone who's doing research into the nutritional value of these plants, because it's highly likely, I'm hypothesizing here, but significantly more nutritious than annual collards or other annual brassicas, which in the first place, brassicas are very, very, very nutritious for you.
I wish more nutritionists would actually study tree collards, of course, and the perennial collards and kales, but that I know of, no one is. And so one concern for me about some of the brassica family is oxalic acids. So I really don't know the content in the tree collards. I would love to know that. And of course, how the different varieties compare in that department. But I do feel that they are really very much nutrition powerhouses, and probably you're right that they are more nutritious than their annual family members, but there's no real way of knowing that. I mean, I feel like I can taste it almost in it, but that's just maybe my bias.
Yeah, if it's bitter, that means it's probably better for us, right?
Right. I mean, I actually don't like to eat raw collards or kales or things like that. It just doesn't feel good in my stomach, so I always tend to cook them. But I know a lot of people are super into raw kales and collards. I joke around that, I'm just so sick of hearing about kale, that in the mainstream culture, people think that kale is so healthy and they should eat it every day, and they eat it in these raw salads all the time and smoothies. And I don't know how great that is for you. I think it's really good to have a diverse diet, and I think that tree collards just should be in everyone's garden in a climate where they can grow them. And they're just one, wonderful thing to eat. But there are many other wonderful things to eat as well. And we should have a diverse diet.
So you're not the only one on your property either eating those collards from what I see. It seems like they're very popular all around, even with our four-legged and two-legged bird friends.
I have a rat that lives in the wood pile near some of the tree collards, which is really feasting on my patch of purple tree collards, which is near the wood pile shed. And then in the front yard, deer were getting in and eating the purple tree collards there. So, it's just been a battle. I finally now have gotten the deer out, and I did go as far to get to the peanut butter for the rat trap. The chickens really love them. It's a staple for them up here.
So you mentioned talking about the particular climate that everyone should be growing tree collards in the climate if they can grow it in their particular climate. Is this an option either now or in the future, do you believe, for colder climate, northern latitude growers? Mike has shared with me some cuttings of some kind of preliminary, potentially cold hardy perennial brassicas, but I'm curious to kind of hear your approach on like the state of affairs right now for cold hardy perennial brassica, collards or kales, and then what you see in the future. Like, is this something that we could look out for with more breeding work?
Yes. So Berkeley, where my original farm is USDA zone 10A, and Grass Valley, even though it gets a lot of snow and temperatures down to 20, it's 9A apparently. So I need more allies in cold places to experiment and share back with me so I can share more with people in cold climates. But the first partnership I've had in that direction is really, really exciting to me. It was with Ken Asmus of Oikos Tree Crops. He had bought a bunch of purple tree collard seed back in the very beginning of Project Tree Collard, so probably 2015 or 2016. He came up with some varieties that he observed over time, over the next like 5 years, that did come back from the roots, and sometimes even the tops stayed alive. So he shared back one that we jointly named Michigan Tree Collard. And this is the first year I've just started to I had seeds available, those sold out, and now I have small plants with roots trickling out to the public just in 2022. He also shared another one that we jointly named Kalamazoo, and that one is probably a year and a half out from being available to the public, because I just have little teeny sprouts of it growing. But it's become a new interest of mine, being in a colder climate and realizing, wow, all these people are into perennial vegetables and things that are in these climates and live in these places I've never been to and have no idea what they grow and how they do things. And I'm so used to my California lens and bias. So I'm really wanting to come up with more varieties that are more cold tolerant. But unfortunately, I didn't move to a place that's zone 6, so I can't really find those so easily.
That's okay, because we're out here to be your interns. In my so far, from all of the different, and I need to do like another big order of cuttings or of rooted plants from you, like in the spring, because when I ordered from you, it was a lot of the issues that I had was that I ordered them at the wrong time of year, and then I overwintered them indoors, and I could go on and on, but basically it seems like for me the chance seedling of dino kale crossed with purple tree collard was doing a lot better and notably more cold hardy for me. I planted all of the tree collards that I got from you in an unheated greenhouse that's very, very poorly insulated. It's, essentially it gets just as cold in there as it does everywhere else, but it just has like a tiny buffer by the fact that there's something covering it essentially. And yeah, I'll report back in the spring. It'll be interesting to see, what pops back up and what doesn't.
Right. Yeah, I wish I heard back from more customers because a lot goes out and I put so much into it, from literally processing the seed by hand, hand winnowing everything and growing the cuttings and, carrying them for all the plants and rooting them in the greenhouse and sending them off into the world. I wish I heard back a bit more about the extreme climates. Like I haven't heard enough back from like Hawaii about which ones are tolerating the humidity either. I have heard really good things about the Merit tree collard seeds in New England. So that's another one that I'm curious about.
Yeah.
Actually, I think someone just told me that Jolly Green seeds did well in a cold climate, but I can't remember at the moment where that was.
I'm wondering if purchasing the seed that is produced and then growing it out in colder climates would, net a better result versus propagating cuttings, because they have more of a genetic chance of being cold hardier than the clonally propagated cuttings. It's never that, and that's something I never thought about before. I always go for the cuttings from you because I'm like, yes, I have a fully grown plant. Like I can't mess this up. Like it's already like so happy and healthy. This baby's gonna come to me, and I'm just gonna be able to like take like growing things. I'm not a good plant dad when it comes to growing things from seed, but I don't know.
Oh, really? You're better with cuttings?
I feel like, I don't know. It's Ben is more of the growing from seed guy of the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny you say that because I was just about to suggest or basically pose the question as far as overwintering for someone in a colder climate who doesn't have necessarily a cold hardy variety, but they just love growing them. I would assume, I didn't try it this year with my purple tree collards, but that you could take cuttings. And is it possible to, I mean, of course you could grow them indoors under grow lamps over the winter. Do you think they would also last the winter? Maybe cuttings kept in a plastic bag, or maybe not in plastic, kept somewhere cool and where they can stay alive? Or do you think they need to get planted and rooted basically very quickly after they've been taken from the mother plant?
Yeah, in cold climates, I advise people to try to get it maybe in the spring after the danger of freezing, and then grow it out to the point where they can take some cuttings in for the winter. And then, yes, wrapping them in a wet paper towel and some plastic around the base and storing them in the fridge. I did that once, just trying to see how it did. And I did a lot of cuttings maybe, and a certain percentage of them survived a few months in the fridge.
It's really helpful to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I have not been doing that. I've just been taking them and then trying to deal with them immediately. And I suppose, so in Grass Valley, it seems like you get quite a bit of snow. Did you find that any of the varieties did better than others after that crazy snowstorm that you had a few weeks ago?
Yeah, so normally Grass Valley doesn't get a lot of snow. This particular year was the biggest snowstorm. We had the biggest rainstorm in like 10 years, and then we had the biggest snowstorm in like 10 years. And I feel like they all did really great. I only see one plant that seems to be on its way out. It's a Jolly Green, and I think it's because of gopher activity and or excessive water from that rainstorm. it's not dead yet, but it's not thriving. It's looking like it might be on its way out. But everything did really well. I was so amazed to see them in snow. A lot of my plants were very, very short. Like I had a whole row of dinosaur tree collards that were only 5-6 inches tall. They were just completely under snow for, I don't know, 5-6 days. And the Michigan, no surprise, just looked gorgeous. And then the taller tree collards that had been there longer, just stood up out of the snow. I think one of the problems I had with the purple tree collards was that they had been so attacked by the rats and the deer, and then the weight of the snow kind of bent them down. And so I had a lot of branch breakage and had to do a lot of pruning and cleanup after that storm. But they seem to be fine.
Gotcha. Very, very cool. I was also wondering, so there's a different sort of perennial kale breeder out there, Chris Homanix, who developed the Homesteaders Perennial Kale Grex, which is being offered primarily through the Experimental Farm Network. I feel like the two of you guys should like cross collaborate or should meet each other, because you guys are doing very similar work. And the kales that he was working with, it was a cross between purple tree collard and Daubentons is how it all got started out.
Yeah, I got a hold of some of his seed a couple years ago, and I've been slowly every year planting a few of the seed and seeing what they do. And it's really interesting to me because when they're small, and I think this is true of my seeds too, whenever I get a chance to have room to grow my own seed, but it's really interesting how when they're small, they really all look pretty much the same for a very long time. And you really have to grow them out for quite a while until you start to see some different characteristics. So that was really fun to play around with his seed. I unfortunately ended up making an irrigation mistake when I moved away. Some of the irrigation was off and some of the plants died. I think a couple survived. They really looked dead. And then they came back as soon as I figured out that the irrigation had been off the whole time. So that hurt a lot of my tree collards, in fact, having that irrigation mistake. But I would love to connect with him. He may be more of a plantsman than I don't know. My understanding was that he actually was experimenting with more different parent plants, including some ornamental kales and some other things. I'm not really sure.
That does sound about right. I think his sort of breeding work goes beyond just that original parentage, but it's just so cool to think that, I mean, like the history of the Daubentons kale, like it's like something that was sheep forage, and then a random French guy in the 1700s was like, oh, this looks pretty good, like why don't I take this home and do exactly the same thing that you're doing, just making it a more edible, delicious, hardy plant. And now 300 years later, it's created this new Grex of plants, and it's also in your garden as well. It's just, I don't know, I'm a big plant nerd when it comes to these hardy brassicas. So that project, that was all Brassica oleracea or oleraceae.
Yes.
And they freely cross-pollinate, which I'm assuming that purple tree collards and all the collards you're working with are the same. So you're never doing like controlled crosses. It's mostly just like letting them all go to town. Is that the case?
Correct. They're all Brassica oleracea, and they all readily cross-pollinate. And one reason I moved from Berkeley was to have more space, because I ran out of space. I couldn't experiment. I couldn't grow out some of my own seeds and come up with new varieties. So here I'm on a couple acres. I have plenty of room to experiment, but I haven't actually researched how far apart they would need to be. I imagine it would be quite far apart, and I'm not going to do that at this time, but I think it's really an interesting project for someone who has way more space to experiment with, where they can control it.
I think that the promiscuous pollination of just letting them all interpollinate, just, waiting for that random seedling to pop up must be such an exciting experience, like so you have several different varieties on the website. Could you just briefly talk about maybe some of the varieties that you have, the different named crosses, and maybe any sort of backstory? I'm interested in, what that experience was of just waking up in the morning and seeing this little guy randomly on, beneath two other plants and being like, huh, okay, like, who are you? Yeah, I don't know.
It's really fun because in Berkeley, it became this experience of just tree collards popping up everywhere. And I had to pull a lot of them because they were in weird locations or not getting any water, or they just died or whatever. But I had them growing in my driveway, and I had them growing next to the trash can and under the deck because I'd processed seeds there, and seeds had blown down, and in my potted plants on my deck and here and there. So one of the fun ones was merit tree collards growing, and then they had dropped their seed. I hadn't collected them all below, and a friend of mine had come by and said, "Oh, wow, that's really interesting plant. I want that one, a baby of that one." And I was like, okay. And instead of giving him clones of it, I just was like, well, all these seedlings are below it. I'll just give him some of those. And so I just gave him a bunch of seedlings, and he grew this one in his garden. And it was just stunning. It was like a lot like the dinosaur tree collard, but larger leaves and more quilty and this beautiful bluish color. And I said, "Hey, can I get a cutting of that from you?" And so he's like, "Sure." And so it came back to me, and I struggled with the name of it. My friend's name is Vitali, and I wanted to name it Vitali's Choice. But I thought that really wasn't so catchy for the general public. So I settled on the name Big Blue. And that's been a really fun, popular discovery that happened in my garden and in his garden. And then I had a rabbit for a really long time. Like, outdoor pet rabbits are not supposed to live very long. And it was my son's pet that I got him when he was like 7. And this tree collard popped up right next to his cage. And he loves tree collards. He's now passed, but he loved tree collards. Like, he lived on them. I think that's why he lived so long. He lived to be like 12. And this tree collard was just monstrous. It was just this beautiful green tree collard. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And so I would give him the leaves because it was right next to his cage. And I named that one in the beginning Copper's Choice or something. I don't know, something about Copper. The rabbit's name was Copper. And then eventually settled on the name Jolly Green because the leaves were just so huge, and it was just kind of comical, just holding one and just like, it's so jolly and it's so green and it's so beautiful. And so that was another one that came up in my garden. I've been working on one that I named Curly Girl, but it's not super close to being out in the public yet. I think it'll be in at least a year. And then I got Michigan from Ken Nasmus, as we talked about, and the purple we talked about, and Merit we talked about. Let's see, Dobbinton is, a very old plant. I've had a lot of trouble propagating the Dobbinton, and I think I might have nailed it down, but everyone wants one, and it's just been very frustrating. I would say when I start a flat of 36 of them, like, I'll only end up with 4 beautiful plants.
So I have a question about the placement and the sun requirements of some of these tree collards. This was only the first time that I grew purple tree collards was this past year. I mostly grew them in a full sun location, and I'm just wondering if you think that finding an area for them that gets some shade in the hottest parts of the summer is good for the quality of the leaves for eating, and then also does the shade kind of help prevent them from going to seed if we're trying to grow these out for as long as possible and kind of delay them going to seed? Does any shade help in kind of the cultivation and growing of the tree collards?
Yeah, I think it really is climate dependent. Like, I think a lot of places, they really need some afternoon shade in, hot, humid climates, especially, or hot, dry climates. This summer, it also surprised me. It got to 113 here, and most of my tree collards are in full sun, and they all survived the heat. But I could tell the front yard ones, purple tree collards, got some more shade, and I could tell that was much appreciated when they got that shade. So I think it really depends. In Berkeley, I grew a number of them in a fair amount of shade. And I find that the main problem with too much shade is that they tend to kind of flop over, and they're going to have a strange form, but they're also going to have a greater tendency to rot if there's like heavy clay soil or any kind of overwatering or just like a lot of rain or humidity perhaps. So yeah, it's a balance between that. And then I think in places like the Pacific Northwest that don't get much sun, then they really need to be in full sun to do well.
That's an interesting thing you brought up, which is soil. Have you, and I'm on a site where there's quite a bit of heavy clay. Have you noticed that they do particularly better in certain kinds of soil? I imagine everybody loves a sandy loam or a loamy sand, but what have your experiences been?
So my Berkeley farm, the area is called clay, but this particular spot, which I'd farmed for 18 years and just added so much compost and amendment, and I don't know, I somehow got lucky. It wasn't clay. Way down it was, but the top 3 or 2 feet were just this beautiful soil, and they loved that. They really grow gorgeous there. And then up here, I have heavy clay, and it varies from like a bluish clay and some really interesting terracotta colors. And it's very, very heavy. And I'm starting a farm from scratch in areas that have never been cultivated. So I just can't really get enough compost and microbial soil life active and going yet. But they're all surviving here. They're all going through these really hot summers and these really cold, wet, snowy winters. And, I think really I only have one that's dying now. I think a couple definitely got eaten by gophers because they literally disappeared. And I have a gopher battle going on, but they're doing really well, even in this clay soil. I just think as long as you kind of plant them high and are careful about how much you water, because clay holds water really, really well. So it might look more dry on the surface, but actually be quite wet down below. The tree collards might not like too much of that.
So thank you for that very in-depth sort of detail. In the height of the pandemic, I ordered a bunch of tree collards from you. I started experimenting with the Homesteaders Grex, and I also ordered Daubentons and Daubentons Panache, which has the one that's variegated from the UK. And a different one that I ordered was Taunton Dean, which I've seen some videos of. If you check out Those Plant People on YouTube or online, they have this perennial brassica that's the size of a tree, has probably a 6-inch diameter, and it's propped up because otherwise it would just flop over. But a propped up kale tree that grows in their like zone 8, zone 9 climate. And I'm not sure if that's because they trained it that way or if that's just what it does. I'm, number one, interested if you've ever heard of Taunton Dean, or if you're interested in including it maybe in these experiments. And also if, kind of like just maybe a description of kind of the habit of some of these perennial kales that you have. Mostly I'm assuming that they're all very bush-like. They're all bush kales that grow to be like 6 feet tall and maybe just as wide. For our listeners, they might not have that dialed in as exactly to how big and how tall and how they grow, that sort of thing.
Right. So to start off with Taunton Dean, I did a trade recently. They sent me some Taunton Dean seeds. They said it was also rarely bloom, like purple tree collards rarely bloom, but I haven't had a chance to take care of those seedlings right now, so I'm not going to plant them yet. I also have someone in England that I'm trying to do a trade with, where he's going to send me cuttings, but it hasn't worked out so far. In the videos that I've seen on YouTube of it, it looks so much like purple tree collard, and so I'm more interested. I'm not like jumping up and down to get my hands on it, but I am excited to try it and see what some of the differences are. The purple tree collards, the older ones that I did let to get to 5 years. I've actually grown them for more than 20 years at this point in time. So at different points in time, I have let them live to be like 8 years old or something like that. They don't maybe get 6 inches, but maybe more like 4 inches. And the merit tree collards also can get about 4 or 5 inch trunk in just me having them for 5 years. So I don't know exactly what all the differences are, but I'm very curious about the Tontandine. As far as habits of the different tree collards that I have, like Dobbinton is a very short, bushy kale. And also the dinosaur tree collards, like very tallest I've seen them get is about 3.5 feet high. So they're also a shorter, bushier, multi-trunked naturally. I find some people send me pictures of their purple tree collards and they give them funny names like Carl, and they just grow up and up and up and up because they don't tip prune them. So over time, I used to let my tree collards like grow really tall, like 8 feet, and I have some that are that tall. But generally, I found I like to keep them shorter, so I like to just keep them shorter for easy harvest and around like 3 or 4 feet high. And those I just keep nice and short by the tip pruning that I do all the time. Merritt really wants to go straight up as a weird sort of a walking stick kale or tree. You know, it just looks kind of weird in that sense, but you can cut the top off and then force it to bush out. Let's see, Jolly Green and Big Blue seem to naturally want to branch out and become bushes. Jolly Green, I still haven't had it long enough. I've probably had it since 2018 or 2019, and I think it could get up to 12 if it's let. In this climate, I can't let it do that because of all the snow and high winds and rainstorms. It would just break branches. But in Berkeley, some of them have gotten really tall. And then Big Blue tend to be around 5 feet, a nice bushy plant.
Very, very cool. Thank you so much for all the deets, and thank you so much for talking with us. I feel like I'm so much more knowledgeable about all these perennial kales now. I feel like such a bad plant dad that I let so many of them just, or so I'm selecting for the climate, but I feel like a lot of it also is just user error on my part. And we definitely need more people reporting back with all of their findings from across the world, or I was going to say across the US, but really across the world. Maybe it's like, maybe like a Facebook group or something along those lines, just a purple tree collard like community experiences group or something could do the job. I don't know, but in the future, I hope that it'd be so valuable to find other people who are also growing purple tree collard and Merritt and anything that they bought from you in similar climates, and if they had any tips and tricks and stuff. So yeah, listeners, if anybody's listening and they're doing this, please respond, reach out to us.
Yeah, so far I've been doing that by email, just random people emailing me and sharing their findings. I do have a Facebook page called Project Tree Collard, but I've never been very tech savvy. I'm getting more and more so. And I don't have the group. I'm mostly just cross posting with Instagram, just so it's mostly me, and then people send me private messages or post on the wall or whatever some pictures of their tree collard they named Carl, and what should they do about Carl because Carl is getting a little scraggly or whatever. And it can be overwhelming how many emails I get. I mean, sometimes I get a few hundred a day, just about shipping and about this and about that, and people inquiries. And I try to keep updating the frequently asked questions part on my website so that those questions that I get all the time can be answered, but a lot of people don't read it. So it can be a little frustrating because there's only at this point in time one of me. And so I'm just trying to keep up with the cultivating the new varieties, shipping out the ones I have, keeping the plants going, updating the website, dealing with waiting lists, dealing with replying to people, and then just trying to live and trying to explore this beautiful new area I moved to and hopefully make a few friends out here. And there's a really strong organic farming community up here. And because of COVID, it's been a little difficult to connect with. Like I went to their food and farming conference for several years before I even moved up here. And it's a really wonderful community, but they haven't had the conference for several years now. So I really am hungry to meet more people in my area that are farming up here because it's a really special place. It's a special climate with special considerations, as everywhere is.
Well, at the risk
Yeah.
of increasing your inbox even more, would you be willing to give out the name of your shop and your website so people can check out what you have going on to stay connected and potentially to shop if you have some in stock?
Yes, of course, come visit the website, and the stock changes constantly. Like it just goes up and down all the time as plants or cuttings or things become available. But some things are just kind of continually in short supply, and I have little waiting lists where people can sign up to get notified when they come back in stock. And I can get really creamed. So lately I've been really creamed and I'm pretty sold out at the moment. But the website is projecttreecollard.org. And I have Facebook and Instagram and a YouTube channel as well, where I'm trying to put out videos, mostly about tree collards, but also some like general homesteading things, or like how to thin your apples and your apple tree kind of videos, as I feel compelled to share.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I will admit I am definitely one of those people who sent the annoying email in the past, and I'm going to try to do better from now on. but yeah, this was
did?
Yes, no, I remember a very long email that I was like, wait, you have this variety and like that variety, and like, is this one across with that one, and like, what about that thing you have? And then after I sent it, I was like, oof, like this probably I should have just maybe not asked this question even in the first place. But yeah, we live and learn. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was an awesome conversation. And to everyone who's listening, if you're growing tree collards and you're experimenting in your zone, when this episode comes out, we'll probably do an Instagram post or something like that. We'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us. You know, I'm growing Sequoiah's plants here in Chile Zone 6B, Connecticut, and trying to do some of the same work in terms of seeing, you know, test the cold hardiness and whatnot. And yeah, I don't know. I'm very excited to see what happens in the next coming year. So thank you, Sequoiah, for all of the amazing work that you've done. There needs to be like 100 more of you everywhere doing this all the time.
Yes, thank you, Sequoiah. And like I said, I'll be in the area. I won't be too far away from you, so I'll definitely be growing. Hopefully, the same. Maybe not all the different tree collards and kales you're growing, but maybe just some of your favorites. The big blue sounded pretty cool. I want to try that one out.
Thanks so much for having me. I'd love to connect with you once you're around, because it would be, you know, really fun. And you're in a slightly different climate, but we have a lot of similar interests, so it's always great gardening experiences and new varieties. California is a really different climate.
Alrighty then, that just about wraps up our episode. Thanks again, Sequoiah, and listeners, if you made it this far, thanks for sticking with us. See you next time.